Chapter 21 of Ingold is really an incredible chapter. I think you called it a culmination. It may be a kind of culmination. Everything from here might be downhill a little bit. 22 is also super good, but it's much more into the language and linguistic stuff. I think you're correct. This is a culmination because in some ways, it's drawing together all the biological anthropology stuff and even a little bit of archaeology and art. And I think we could probably read this chapter a few times. I certainly have. We could go into each of the subpoints and see what's happened with them and trace them out. Maybe someday we will. But I want to begin with the Cro-Magnons. I think for a long time in my life, I didn't understand who these people were because I pronounced it like that. I just said in my American way, Cro-Magnon. But people who speak French, which is where these people were found, pronounce it in a much more beautiful way. Do you want to try the French?
Do they like connect the G to the N?
Yeah.
So Mignon.
Yeah.
I don't like that.
You don't like that? Yeah, it is I mean, not to be confused with filet mignon, I guess, but yeah, it's Cro-Magnon. And so it sounds more sophisticated, even if you don't like it. It does sound better than, or it sounds more sophisticated because there they were making those cave paintings, and there's all kinds of them. The people who made these paintings were discovered in this area. We don't really call them, as that web link says, we don't call them that anymore. They're more likely to be called early modern humans. Sometimes people call them anatomically modern humans, although for the most part, people believe that anatomically modern humans would have originated in Africa and spread into Europe from there. But either way, this is basically the people who could do this, could do these paintings. Do you have to look at these paintings? Yeah, what do they say about them?
That sometimes they might be like an old style of animation, maybe. That's like the wildest theory.
Wow, yeah, look at that. Huh.
If you're looking at them from like torchlight,
right,
flickering, it might look like they're moving.
That they were depicting movement. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Do they get excited about these?
No one ever does, but like that's the like art I like of everything else.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing. I mean, you know, they often are used to start off your art class, your art history class, to start it off. And as you know, discovering these paintings and the anatomical people of that era, a lot of paleoanthropologists and other people to proclaim that these were people like us. But of course, the question is, if they're so good at painting those things and doing animation by torchlight, why weren't they riding bicycles? Why couldn't they ride a bicycle? And of course, Ingold says, well, that's a goofy question. So, and then he goes on to explain, and sometimes I go through in more detail, the orthodox view of human evolution. And hopefully you get this from your biological anthropology class or your intro to anthropology class. But basically, the orthodox view is that, sure, things like walking, so that being able to walk, habitual bipedalism, is what separated the creatures that would eventually become more and more like humans is what separates them with our most recent common ancestor, which then became also chimpanzees and bonobos. So that bipedalism is what splits us off from the other apes, and that it is a biological, anatomical, and evolutionary change, and that evolution keeps going and it keeps going, and we get people more and more kind of like us. But being able to ride a bicycle is something that's pretty new in human history. We've only been doing that for a little bit of time, a tiny amount of time, and not everybody does it. And so you need certain historical and cultural conditions in order to ride a bicycle. So we believe that bipedalism, walking, is a species trait. Art, we also actually believe, is a species trait. Language, a species trait. But then the particular things that we do with that, bicycling would be one of them, painting, sculpture, Spanish, English, those would be determined by our culture. Cinco de Mayo, that's a cultural thing. They didn't do that back then. So that's the orthodox view. And of course, Ingold is here to mess us up. Shall now go on to show why I think it is wrong. Now, before I get too far into this, Ingold is not saying that evolution is wrong. He's not a creationist. He'll have a bunch of things. He's not saying there's no such thing as genetics or that we can't walk or cycle. But what he's saying is that actually both walking and cycling are remarkably similar in the sense of there being skilled activity. So walking, although we say that it is an anatomical, biological, evolutionary thing to do, is something that we learn how to do. We do not come out walking. There are some animals that come out pretty locomoting from the moment of birth, but humans are not one of those. And there's various, well, let's go on to the next part of this. If you did not have the assistance of caregivers, one, you wouldn't be able to stay alive, but you also need the assistance of caregivers to learn this walking thing. And there's all sorts of devices that we use to help our little kids learn how to walk. And so we hold up their hands with our fingers. And in Colombia, where I did field work, a person would take her shawl and sort of wrap it around so the infant could push against that and then be standing up and kind of moving around. And of course, walkers and various technological devices that we have. But it's something that we actively encourage and teach our children to do. They don't just do it from the beginning. It's of course not something, once we've learned it, it leaves a biological imprint in our developing organism. And Ingold says that, of course, if the conditions are right, if you have the skilled caregivers in a particular environment, it is bound to emerge, that it's going to happen as long as you have all the equipment necessary and you're not in some ways differently abled. It is going to emerge given the right conditions. He also spent some time imagining some conditions in which it wouldn't emerge, such as if we were in an environment of weightlessness, or if wheeled vehicles were all we used to get around in, which he says is admittedly a little bit out there, but you can imagine a situation in which people really don't know how to walk. I'm thinking, is this what happened in WALL-E, the movie? They couldn't walk, right?
Yeah. They could, they just had to, it was really hard to walk.
It was really hard to walk. Okay, yeah, it's been a while. I started to think, hey, wait a second. We did that in a movie. So it is bound to emerge, but the conditions have to be correct. And one can imagine conditions in which it might not emerge as well. How about bicycling? Well, obviously, we also learn how to do that. We usually learn it with people around us, perhaps from our peers. Many people usually, I think most people learn how to cycle with an adult around. Maybe some people learn on their own. I don't know. I don't want to pry too much about if or whether people learned how to cycle and how. But usually there's somebody around. Ingold says that it's like walking, you don't usually forget it. In fact, we have a phrase, right? It's just like riding a bicycle, which, and you'd think that that's a little bit far-fetched, but I have to say in my own life that I would go for years, went for years, like 20 years without riding a bicycle. And then all of a sudden when I had to ride one again, it was like, I mean, sure, it took a little bit, but it wasn't like I had to relearn it. It was already there. It was already in the skill was there. You don't actually forget it. You just get back on and start riding again. And it's, again, obviously some people, even in the conditions where there are bicycles, even in the same family, I won't mention anyone in my extended family, but some people didn't learn how to ride a bicycle and some people did. But if you give people the correct conditions and all the circumstances are right, it's basically bound to emerge. So basically what Ingold says on page 375 is it is a difference of extent rather than principle. If walking is innate in the sense, and only in the sense that given certain conditions, it is bound to emerge in the course of development, then the same applies to cycling. Both walking and cycling are skills that emerge in the relational context of the child's involvement in its surroundings and are therefore properties of the developmental system constituted by these relations. So they are both skills. I'd also like to, they are skills and they are things that in some ways change our developing anatomy. And there's a footnote, an endnote in Ingold on page 434. The first endnote from here is about the skeleton and the form of the skeleton. And I sometimes make students squat down for a few minutes just to feel the squat and feel what it's like to squat. And for most of us, it's we can't do it. But if you're raised in a squatting society, you have a different little notch in your knee, and we could do a whole class squatting with no trouble at all. So Ingold says here, the bones of the skeleton can grow and take shape only within a body that is active in the world. Hence, one can define the normal skeleton only in relation to normal activities. Why should the notched kneecap that comes from prolonged squatting be regarded as abnormal when, for the great majority of the human population, this is the usual position of rest? It is only perceived by us as an abnormality since, having been brought up in a society in which it is usual to sit on chairs, here we are, we find having to squat for any length of time acutely stressful. There can then be no such thing as the standard form of the human skeleton. So what Ingold is saying is the majority of societies, at least up to maybe 20, 30 years ago, the majority of societies, the position of rest was squatting, and so you developed a notched kneecap, which made it possible and comfortable to squat. And he says, well, why should that be considered abnormal or different? It's only abnormal in relation to those of us who grew up with our legs hanging down from chairs, and so we don't develop those kneecaps. And thus you can't really specify even the human skeleton as a kind of apart from the activities it's in. I actually like to think about this. Ingold doesn't bring up crawling, being able to crawl, but I like to think about it in terms of crawling, in part because when I started teaching this class, well, my child was learning how to crawl, and it was really interesting to watch because you can't really, we try to teach our children how to walk, but you can't really teach them how to crawl. All you do is you put the baby down on its tummy and it will learn how to crawl. You don't have to do anything else, it will learn. You know, I would crawl around, but the truth of the matter is adults crawl differently than babies learn how to crawl. Adults, because we have more balance or because we're just ganglier, we do what's called parallel crawling, where we move our right arm and our right leg together and our left arm and our left leg together. The infant instead learns cross crawling, which gives it more balance, where its right arm and left and right move together. So I couldn't even teach the infant, even if I wanted to. I'd be teaching it wrong and it wouldn't listen to me, even if it could speak. So they learn how to crawl, and given the right conditions, any baby is going to learn that. You just put them on their tummy and eventually they're going to learn. It takes them a while. And so it isn't even with adult guidance. You just put them in this situation, which, as Ingold is saying here, that's how we teach people things, is not necessarily by imparting linguistic instructions, or even, I mean, we obviously often try to show people things, but in this case, we're basically just giving them a task, putting them on their tummy. And apparently the psychologists sometimes say that this is a good thing to do because it builds different kinds of muscles in the infant, and it builds different neurological things, pathways, and it's a good thing to do before they start to learn how to walk. But I guess what I would say here is what's also interesting is that this is something that will naturally emerge if you just leave any baby on its tummy. But the thing of the matter is, the majority of human societies, they haven't wanted to leave babies on their tummies on the ground. That would not be a good idea. And so probably the vast majority of human beings never learn how to crawl. We usually have the infants either swaddled or carried or in baskets, or you definitely don't want them on the ground. That's a really crazy place to put them. I was doing my fieldwork in Colombia. They would not want an infant on the ground. They're crawling around and all the crap that's on the ground. Plus, they didn't like people being on all fours. They thought that made them look too animal-like. So you want to be upright as soon as possible. So what's interesting is, on the one hand, this will naturally develop if given the right conditions and given you want to, and it will develop without any verbal instruction or showing whatsoever. And it does create anatomical and neurological changes, but most human societies don't do it. And we're in fact at the point where a lot of our own babies, and even in our societies, don't learn how to crawl because we have them in car seats all the time and on their backs to sleep. So we don't give them enough tummy time, so they never really learn how to crawl. So again, what's interesting here is that even something like this, which might be considered something that is on a developmental cycle, and now they're like, oh, you got to make sure your baby can crawl, is not really, in some ways, it could not be considered a human universal. I dug this up a long time ago, back in 2012, about 10 years ago. One of the students secretly snapped a photo of me as I was demonstrating parallel crawl and cross crawl on this desk. We took down that thing. There it is, right here. Look, the chairs are still the same. It's still the same. Oh, wait, we changed that chair? What chair is different? Posters are different. Anyway, that's why I don't do it anymore. Somebody might be recording it. By now we'd have a video. It'd be terrible. In this chapter, Ingold says that this is in some way analogous to another debate, which is about speech and the universality of language as speech versus the technical, what is said to be writing, which is specific and to culture and history. And I think that he's going to be talking about that a lot more in the next chapter. So this is just kind of a little bit of a preview from that to that. The one part on page 378 where he talks about the chimpanzee in the environment of humans, he's talking about these debates of, we taught bonobos and chimpanzees and gorillas. Some of them we've taught sign language and even to use like keyboards and stuff like that. And the question has been, well, does that mean, that they have a capacity for language? And what Ingold is saying here is that at the chimpanzee in an environment of other chimpanzees is not at all the same kind of animal as the chimpanzee in an environment of humans. And so again, what he's trying to say here is you can't specify the species characteristics or the capacity outside of the conditions under which it was raised. There's no capacity, there's no environmentally, there's no capacity that you can't specify outside of the environment and say, aha, there you have it for all members of that species. And he goes on to say it's the same with walking. There's not something that can be called an essence of walking, which all people have to do. Which is leading up to his argument against one of the most famous quotes of all time in anthropology from Clifford Geertz. We've seen a little bit of Clifford Geertz back in the culture chapter. Oh, we saw Geertz back in the chapter on the spider webs too, and the web of culture. Geertz gives us a lot of nice quotes. I call this the footprints quote of anthropology. And the reason I do that is when I was raised in a church community in which there was always a chance that you could testify during the church service. So it was, it wasn't like it wasn't predefined. You could always raise your hand during the testimony period. It's kind of like in class, if I say, you can interrupt me at any time. It's kind of like that, not at any time. You can have a time for testimonies. And the thing was, in this church, people were generally brought in as adults who had already sinned a lot and then been saved. It wasn't something that usually people grew up in. It was much more kind of a thing for people who had already been in a different place. But for me, I was raised in this church, and then these adults would come in and they'd get saved, and then like a month later, they'd raise their hands during the testimony part and they'd say, I just read the most beautiful poem in the world and I want to share it with you. And I'd start to groan and hold my head in my hands because it was always the footprints poem. Don't know if you know this one. It's a good thing to learn if you're into this stuff. Guy's at the end of his life, or maybe he's dead, goes to looks back over the sea. I probably should get out the actual words. And notices that there's two sets of footprints all the way through. You've heard this? No. But then at the worst times of life, there's only one set of footprints. And ask God, why, Jesus? Why is there only one set of footprints at the worst part of my life? You're supposed to be by me the whole time. The Lord says, my child, that was when I carried you. And they're like, there it is, the footprints. Anyway, the reason I call this the footprints poem is because, or the footprints of anthropology, is because it's this wonderful thing by Geertz in which he says that we begin with the natural equipment to live 1,000 kinds of life. So the idea here is that we as human beings are all one species that is capable of living. We begin with a natural equipment to live 1,000 kinds of life, but end in the end having lived only one. So we could have lived all these different lives. Maybe if you had been born somewhere else, you could have lived these other lives. And so this is seen as, in my view, kind of saying, okay, we have all these biological capacities, but they get translated through a specific culture. And so for Ingold to argue against this, oh my goodness. The reason Ingold is arguing against this is he's saying that the differences in culture become part of our biology. So you can't separate out the cultural from the biological. Now I want to immediately specify this. Actually, let's read here for a second. This is on 379, right after the Geertz formulation. My point contra Geertz, against Geertz, is that human beings are not naturally pre-equipped for any kind of life. Rather, such equipment as they have comes into existence as they live their lives through a process of development. So in some ways, he's perhaps being even more radical than Geertz in that we're not pre-equipped for any kind of life, and our equipment comes into existence through this process of development. So when he's saying that the culture is biological, what he's really absolutely not trying to say is that it becomes part of it's part of some sort of genetic blueprint or our biological endowment. And I wanted to go through that a little bit more than I usually do, in part because of the current political situation in which some people are trying to limit, they're trying to limit the rights that women have over their own bodies in the name of the idea that somehow conception is the same as life. And a lot of this is done on so-called religious grounds. I believe that the church I previously described growing up in has probably been a big part of that movement. But in some ways, I think that the idea that the genes carry life, and so that at the point of conception, the fusion of egg and sperm, all of a sudden you have a blueprint for an organism. I think that plays directly into the hands of the people who want to limit reproductive justice. Now, the biologists might say, well, we never intended it that way, but basically, in some ways, the way that they got all excited about the DNA led to this, or leads to similar kinds of ideas, or can play into them. And I want to bring out, this is on pages 380 to 381, where Ingold is talking about the work of a really interesting historian of modern biology, Lily Kay. And Kay's work shows that, you know, you have this DNA that came out and they had their little letters and stuff. And the problem is like, well, what do you do with those letters? How is it that the DNA specifies the organism? And so what Ingold says here, again, drawing on Lily Kay's work, that the biologists started drawing upon the information theory, the theory of information. But as he says here, that what they were saying, the notion of information, referred to the semantic, or took the notion of information in a specialized sense. Information for these theorists had no semantic value whatever. It did not mean anything. In their terms, a random string of letters could have the same informational content as a Shakespeare sonnet. So what they were trying to say was, they were talking about information in the sense that any, like I said, a random string of letters had the same informational value as a Shakespeare sonnet. That is to say, it was different than the way we understand it as conveying a message. And then, as Ingold says, the point was entirely lost on the biologists, who, you know, said it was just information and then jumped to the conclusion that it was a code. And then apparently the information theorists were repeatedly warning against doing it. And they, on page 381, they looked on in dismay as the scriptural metaphors of message, language, text, and so forth became entrenched in a biology that had become seemingly intoxicated with the idea of DNA as a book of life. So those intoxicated biologists were very excited about the idea that the DNA was going to somehow give us a complete specification or a pattern or a message, whereas the information theorist says, no, that's not the way you should be looking at it. I looked up Lily Kay, kind of sad. She passed away very young at 53 years old. She was actually originally from Poland, children of people in a concentration camp. So sad that she didn't get to do more writing and research on these things, but really interesting. This book was in the library. I haven't checked it out recently, but Who Wrote the Book of Life? A History of the Genetic Code. What she's doing is, in fact, criticizing this idea that the genetic code is like a book, or like a scripture, or like a blueprint. In saying that the DNA is not what the biologists think it is, Ingold goes through his classifications of what he does not believe, or believes and does not believe, in the sense of, I do not deny that there are genes and that they are important regulators. And he also says that he does not deny that genomic change can be evolutionarily important. But what he does deny is that these function as we've seen in previous chapters, they function as a complete blueprint, a design, or there are genes for things. He also denies that evolution is only genetic. And so on page 385, there's a really good summary of that. Much genetic change occurs without any corollary on the level of form or behavior. Conversely, significant morphological or behavioral transformation may occur without any corresponding changes in the genome. Now, I think what's interesting is that since this was written, there have been I think that in biology itself, there's been a lot of advances in how we understand genetics, and that, at least by my reading, a lot of people now know that there's been a ton of genetic change in the human species, and that in many ways, what we think of as the early modern humans were actually genetically closer to Neanderthals than they are to contemporary humans. Again, a lot of genetic change has occurred, which doesn't necessarily have corollaries in the physiological stuff. And on the other hand, in biology, there's been a lot more emphasis, or some people have brought us the idea of niche construction, which talks about the changes in the environment that all organisms take place, or participate in, and so can contribute to the evolutionary field. So I think there's been a lot of, I think that Ingold in some ways here was a little bit ahead of his time, or was drawing on things in biology that have gotten it sometimes more play, sometimes. But the idea that evolution is the evolution of an entire system altogether is perhaps still pretty radical in biology, and perhaps even in anthropology. So one of the questions then is, how do we explain why organisms are stable over time? What is it? If we don't have the genes, if the genes are not the blueprint, what is the source of the stability? Gabe, I thought you did well on this. What are the genes in? What's the DNA in? It's in those eggs. Oh, yeah. Right. And so, the idea is, like, the DNA doesn't do anything by itself. If we just throw out some DNA there, it's not going to start building an organism. It has to be in an egg, which is in a maternal environment, which is in a world. And so I thought you did well with this on page 383. Let's see, how are we to explain the stability of form across generations? The answer lies in the observation that life of any organism is inaugurated with far more than its complement of DNA. For one thing, as Lewontin points out, the DNA is contained within an egg, which, even before fertilization, is equipped for its own development with the essential prerequisites for launching further growth. So, in terms of this current debate about, or if there is any debate, it's not really a debate about when life begins. I think the good biologists and the biology that I was taught is like, well, life is continuously going on. So those eggs are ready to go, and they have a schedule for growth. Even before fertilization, they have DNA, and the vast majority of them are going to go through menstruation. Just like all those sperm, they're ready to go, and they just very wasteful, the sperm. And to take this a step further, most of the time, most fertilized eggs are actually, even in humans, are not going to make it. We've only recently been understanding this because people only realize things like miscarriages if they occur after a certain point in the development where you understand it as a miscarriage. A lot of the fertilized eggs leave without ever doing anything else. So there's not actually one point at which we can say, aha, there it is. It's, as we've seen in previous chapters, life is continuously going on, and It is only interrupted or punctuated by these various events. So the stability part is that if you change, you have the gene, the DNA, and it's replicating within an egg in an environment. And if you change any part of that environment, you're going to change the developmental process. If you think back to salamanders, if you change any part of that developing organism, it can create a whole very different, weird looking creature than we would have thought would emerge from the DNA. And if we change the environment, we then also change the conditions for successor generations as well. So all of these things contribute to our development and our stability of form over time. So if we think back to those bicycles, or as Ingold talks us back to cycling again, you know, the idea, like language or crawling or all these things, is that the way we teach is what is called, Locke calls guided reinvention. So in this case, talking about language, how we provide contextually specific interpretations that lead the infant to the discovery of how words can be used to convey meaning. You've ever tried to seen a parent like help a babbling toddler into understanding what's going on? You know, it's this process of back and forth so that eventually the kid figures out what is working. I think I've already probably told you about, you know, my own learning how to ride a bike and how I was just basically put at the top of a hill and pushed down. I did eventually embody those skills and they didn't go away. My own children, I think I found from YouTube a better idea of taking the pedals off so they could learn how to balance first. Not so many bruises. But again, on page 387, what each generation contributes to the next are not rules and schemata for the production of appropriate behavior, rather specific conditions of development under which successors growing up in a social world acquire their own embodied skills and dispositions. So to acquire own skills and dispositions. The implications of this are pretty radical, in that what Ingold is saying is that we really can't sustain the distinction between the customary distinction between evolution and history. And what we call evolution, we might say, is just history going on in the larger biological world. And what we call history is just evolution going on in the human world. So this is on page 390. He says it cannot be sustained, the orthodox distinction, regarded as a process whereby people in their activities shape the context of development for their successors. History reappears as the continuation by another name of a process of evolution that is going on throughout the organic world. So if evolution always entails the wider environment, and that's part of the evolutionary process, and we aren't the same organisms if we don't have that. As we modify that wider environment, whether we call it history or whether we call it evolution, it's actually the same process. And he quotes here one of the most famous lines from Karl Marx. I think I might have given it to you back in Cultural Anthropology from the 18th Brumaire. Marx wrote that men, we probably say people now, but back then he said, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. So this was Marx. He was kind of bumming out since his revolution hadn't really worked out the way he wanted it to, and was trying to figure out why, and came up with this line, which is that yes, people are controlling their own history, but they don't have a blank slate to work with. They work with the conditions that are given to us from the past and transmitted from there. Ingold then uses this to say, in just the same way do organisms in general make their own evolution. So that people, creatures are the producers as well as the products of this evolution. Now, one of the big things about the orthodox view is, and one of the reasons anthropologists like the Geertz quote, is because we try to oppose it to the, as Ingold puts it back on 389, the very awful racist views that emerged following taking up some of Darwin's material and trying to put it together with some pre-existing racist ideas, is the idea that we're all the same species but just culturally different. What Ingold says here at the end of the chapter is that the variations of developmental circumstance make us organisms of different kinds. So again, he's saying that the way we develop, we all become different people biologically and culturally all at the same time. And what he's trying to say is there is no species specific essential form of humanity, no way of saying what an anatomically modern human is apart from the manifold ways in which humans actually become. So you can't have a specification for the species outside of the actual becoming of it. Of course, this raises a question. I've always written a question mark in my own copy of this. Thus, my conclusion that the differences we call cultural are indeed biological carries no racist connotations whatever. Which is sort of a bold assertion to make. I feel like people could turn this into something racist if they wanted to, and probably in the United States will figure out a way. So I was trying to figure out, I think Ingold is correct that his statement, his conclusion doesn't carry any racist connotations, but we just have to be careful we know what he's saying so that we don't end up back in the same problem. So I was thinking about these lasso users and these iPhone users. And I think what Ingold is saying is that the child who grows up using mostly lassos in a lasso using environment, and the child who grows up using mostly iPhones in an iPhone using environment, and let's assume that these are not the same children, that they live in very different places, that they are going to be culturally different, but also biologically different and neurologically different. Now, when we say that, though, that's not to say one of these are inferior or superior. If you took the iPhone using child and put them in the lasso using environment, they would be in serious trouble, and probably vice versa as well. And we should specify that these things are always changing and that people are always interconnected to each other. But I think it probably is useful to think about that we can't actually specify a human being as a species outside of the particular ways in which we become human. I think, let's just say that the orthodox view in anthropology that we all are one biological species, but we all have different cultures, hasn't exactly eliminated racism and its consequences in the world. And so maybe this will work better.